Tonight we begin with a development that Pentagon officials had feared, dismissed, and ultimately failed to prepare for, a strike that unfolded not over days, not over weeks, but in mere hours. Hours that reshaped the battlefield, hours that exposed critical vulnerabilities, hours that forced Washington to scramble for answers it did not have. What Russia did tonight crossed a line that American defense planners had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, speed, and devastating force. This is not speculation. This is not analysis from unnamed sources trying to spin the narrative. This is what happened. This is what the Pentagon missed. And this is what Ukraine did about it. All in a single night that has fundamentally changed the trajectory of this war. Let me walk you through everything we know. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official communications, not diplomatic channels, just signals, that Moscow was preparing something unusual. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a doctrine that Western intelligence agencies had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in the Pentagon this week was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the encrypted radio bursts between forward units, the logistics convoys, moving ammunition to staging areas, the repositioning of air defense systems, the sudden increase in reconnaissance drone activity. All of that went quiet. And whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Intelligence officers who spoke with defense correspondents described the silence as operationally significant. That's a term they don't use lightly. It means that Russian forces had shifted into a mode designed specifically to avoid detection. They were masking their movements. They were dispersing their assets. They were preparing for something they didn't want anyone to see coming. And for nearly 72 hours, the Pentagon watched and waited, hoping their assessment was wrong. It wasn't. Early this morning at approximately 2:40, 7 a.m. local time, satellite reconnaissance detected what analysts described as a coordinated multi-axis assault formation, including armored columns and mobile artillery platforms that had not been activated in over 14 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific, a major offensive push, a strategic repositioning, or an attempt to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses before Western support can arrive. Intelligence officers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts military posture without explanation, even by a few kilometers, the Pentagon pays attention. What made the situation even more alarming was the timing. This happened during a gap in satellite coverage, a window of approximately 40 minutes when American reconnaissance assets were transitioning orbits. That's not a coincidence. Russia knew exactly when that window would open, and they used it. The warning issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official described Russia's move as provocative, escalatory, and perhaps most importantly, operationally sophisticated in a way that suggests direct Kremlin involvement, but provocation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most aggressive and coordinated we've seen since the early months of the invasion. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of detecting the Russian assault formations, Ukrainian forces launched a counterstrike that military analysts are calling surgically devastating. These weren't the improvised drone attacks we've seen in recent months. These were precision-guided munitions and coordinated artillery barrages, systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to neutralize high-value targets. The speed of the response suggests that Ukraine had contingency plans ready. They were not caught off guard. The Pentagon was. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that their forces launched coordinated strikes on 17 separate targets, including a forward command post that had recently been activated for what analysts believe was tactical coordination of the assault. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate their positions. They hit ammunition depots in 3 locations. They hit mobile radar installations that were providing targeting data. They hit logistics convoys that were likely preparing to resupply the advancing columns. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of the Russian assault, the command and control infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Russia's midnight ambush wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could have created a strategic breakthrough if left unchecked, and Ukraine, understanding that, fully responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't waste munitions on dispersed infantry positions. They didn't target hardened bunkers that would require sustained bombardment. They hit the nodes, they hit the links, they hit the elements that Russia cannot easily replace. Military experts watching this unfold described Ukraine's targeting as textbook combined arms doctrine. They struck communications first, logistics second, and then followed up with precision attacks on exposed armor that no longer had coordination or resupply. Within 6 hours, the Russian assault had stalled. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Defense analysts now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington. Moscow wanted to see whether Ukraine would hesitate, whether their Western partners would delay, whether the cracks in the alliance had widened enough to exploit. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for permission. They launched a counteroffensive that was so swift, so precise, that even Russian military bloggers noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today Kyiv did. A senior defense official speaking with reporters under anonymity described Russia's shift as opportunistic probing, a way to gauge weaknesses without committing to a full offensive. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse or seek cover. That timing matters because it shows Ukrainian intelligence is operating at a level that exceeds what many analysts had assumed. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian moves, they are anticipating them. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian artillery units carried out sustained bombardments on 3 staging areas, forcing Russian armor to retreat or risk annihilation. Special operations forces targeted a communications hub that had been established in the last 72 hours. Drone units operating behind Russian lines reportedly destroyed fuel depots used by Moscow to sustain forward operations. This wasn't just defense, this wasn't just retaliation. This was strategic denial. This was battlefield shaping. And battlefield shaping is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed push toward Kyiv. For every advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates consolidation. They don't just contest ground, they make holding it expensive. And tonight they made Russia's ambush very, very expensive. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall before the West could respond. They thought Ukrainian resistance would crumble once the tanks rolled in. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. 3 years into this conflict, Ukraine is launching counterstrikes that catch Russian forces off guard. 3 years in, Ukraine is demonstrating tactical flexibility that Russia's rigid command structure cannot match. 3 years in, and the Kremlin is still struggling to achieve objectives they expected to accomplish in a long weekend. This is not the war Moscow planned. This is not the quick victory Putin promised his people. And with every failed offensive, every stalled advance, every midnight ambush that gets turned back, the gap between Russian propaganda and Russian reality grows wider. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want escalation. Oligarchs want stability. Nationalist factions want territorial gains they can use for propaganda. And the Russian public, increasingly isolated from accurate information, wants an end to a war they were told was already won. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing an economy under crushing sanctions. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The midnight ambush wasn't a sign of Russian confidence. It was a sign of Russian desperation, a calculated risk designed to create a narrative of progress that Moscow badly needs, and Ukraine just denied them that narrative. The Pentagon statement, now distributed to allied capitals, designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russian aggression to go unanswered. Officials said plainly that Russia's actions were inconsistent with any pathway toward de-escalation. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to let it work. You don't usually hear that tone from the Defense Department unless something serious is at stake. The statement also confirmed that the United States is accelerating delivery of certain defensive systems that had been scheduled for later deployment. That's not routine. That's a response to what happened tonight. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a brief, defiant speech tonight. He said, "They came in the darkness expecting to find us sleeping. They found us ready." He said, "Every missile they launch, we will answer. Every position they take, we will contest. Every lie they tell, we will expose." And he said, "Ukraine does not break. Ukraine bends the enemy until they shatter." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that every day Ukraine holds the calculus shifts further against Moscow. And tonight, Ukraine did more than hold. They pushed back. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the midnight assault, Belarusian forces also conducted unusual exercises near the northern border. Iranian supply drone activity increased significantly in the past 48 hours. Russian cyber units increased attacks targeting Ukrainian infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This wasn't a single tactical decision. This was a coordinated effort involving multiple actors, multiple domains, and multiple objectives. And that level of coordination doesn't happen by accident. It requires planning, it requires resources, it requires Kremlin authorization. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a renewed offensive before spring, hoping to lock in territorial gains before any potential diplomatic negotiations. Another is that Moscow is attempting to draw Ukrainian resources away from other sectors, creating opportunities for breakthroughs elsewhere. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to create a fait accompli, a situation on the ground so changed that Western partners feel pressured to accept a negotiated settlement on Moscow's terms. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for instructions. They didn't coordinate through bureaucratic channels. They didn't ask permission. They acted. And in doing so, they demonstrated that Russia cannot dictate the tempo of this war. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine can sustain this level of response over time. Ukraine wants to show that their capacity for defense is not diminishing. NATO wants to prevent escalation beyond Ukraine's borders, and Washington wants to prevent a scenario where American credibility becomes tied to a conflict it cannot directly control. These are not aligned interests, they're overlapping, yes, but they're not identical. And in the gaps between those interests, Russia sees opportunity. Tonight's events were designed to exploit those gaps. Ukraine's response was designed to close them. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian force dispositions across the entire front. They say Russian units that participated in the assault have pulled back to defensive positions. They say there's increased encrypted communication traffic suggesting command-level discussions about what went wrong. And they say Russia's decision to launch this operation is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western resolve ahead of critical political decisions in Washington. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, targeted, and overwhelming, sent a message to Moscow that miscalculation comes at a cost. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine remains a partner worth supporting. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this midnight ambush. But what we do know is that the Pentagon's warning was timely. It mobilized Allied attention, it accelerated support commitments, and it demonstrated that even when caught off guard, the response apparatus can function. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 48 hours. If they withdraw and reassess, this moment will be remembered as another failed gamble by a desperate regime. If they escalate further, Ukraine and its partners have already shown they're prepared to meet force with force. They have shown they are ready to respond. They have shown that the cost of aggression will always exceed whatever gains Moscow hopes to achieve. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be genuinely uncertain about what comes next. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after a failed operation, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight, Russia learned something they have learned many times before but refused to accept. Ukraine will not surrender. The West will not abandon them. And midnight ambushes do not change the fundamental reality of this war. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Russia's gamble failed. Ukraine's response succeeded. And the Pentagon, despite being caught off guard, is now fully alert to what Moscow is planning. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.